Cranes were brought in from 3 separate states, their steel cables as thick as a man's arm, accompanied by 24 laborers accustomed to moving monuments far larger. Yet, after 70 years, the statue of Our Lady atop Rosary Hill remained unbudged, not by a single inch. Some whispered of divine intervention, others of an ancient curse. It stands sentinel on the highest elevation of St. Mary's Creek, a quiet, often overlooked corner of Kentucky, encircled by undulating fields and roads bordered by mature maple trees. From miles away, the alabaster figure of the Virgin Mary is visible, her arms outstretched, her gaze cast downward, as though she has been a silent witness to every sunrise and every tempest since her arrival. For the townsfolk, she is more than mere sculpted stone. She is a guardian, a promise etched in marble. They have brought their triumphs, their sorrows, their newborns, and their dying to her feet. And for generations, a singular, unspoken truth has been passed down. You do not disturb the lady on the hill. The precise identity of those who initially erected her there is a matter of fading memory, each recollection differing. Old Martha Grady attributed it to Irish immigrants, returning from conflict with nothing but their faith and a solemn vow to Providence. Pastor Jim recalled the parish priest, from a time when daily mass was customary, and every man in the county donned his finest suit for worship. For the teenagers who seek her out on warm summer evenings, she has simply always been present, as integral to the landscape as the very hill she graces. Regardless of the variations, these tales converge on a single, steadfast belief. The lady herself selected this location, and she is not to be moved. Then, the plans emerged. Glossy brochures circulated, and closed-door city council meetings convened. The proposal bore an elegant title, St. Mary's Spiritual Retreat and Resort, envisioned as a means to revitalize the struggling town through faith-based tourism. Tucked away in fine print, so minute it was initially missed by most, was a single, critical sentence. Relocate existing statue to accommodate new access road. The matter began as hushed rumors at Tony's diner, discussed over lukewarm coffee. By Friday, every establishment along Main Street was abuzz. By Sunday, Father Brennan found his mass interrupted by the sharp, expectant gazes of his parishioners. A significant portion of the community saw this as a lifeline, a chance to escape decades of economic stagnation. The remainder, however, felt a disquieting premonition, a chilling apprehension that something sacred was on the verge of being desecrated. Subsequently, the peculiar occurrences began. First, an architecture student tasked with measuring the statue's base reported a dream in which the statue toppled, not to the earth, but directly onto his own architectural drawings. Shortly thereafter, a contractor from Cincinnati, while ascending the initial steps leading to the monument, suffered a fractured wrist, despite the stone being bone dry. Whispers then surfaced regarding a bell. Numerous residents insisted they had heard its tolling, an ancient bronze church bell, its resonance deep and resonant, ringing out once. Yet no bell had ever existed on Rosary Hill. By the time the first colossal crane entered the town limits, a silent throng had already gathered at the foot of the hill. They carried no banners, uttered no shouts. They simply stood, hands tucked into pockets, their eyes fixed upward. Some murmured prayers, while others stared intently at the statue, as if challenging it to betray any sign of life. Even those who championed the resort's construction felt a prickle of unease. Discussing the statue's relocation was one matter. Witnessing heavy steel being fastened to its shoulders was an entirely different prospect. That morning, an easterly wind carried the scent of rain that never materialized. Amidst the assembled crowd, Martha Grady made the sign of the cross and whispered the same fervent plea she had uttered for 70 years, ever since she had placed a small, chipped piece of limestone at the statue's base. "If you save us, we'll keep you here forever." Though most did not hear her words, those who did would forever remember them, for what transpired next irrevocably altered the perception of Rosary Hill, not only for the town, but for a much wider region. there is no universal consensus in saint. Mary's Creek regarding the precise narrative of how the lady came to preside over Rosary Hill. However, certain fragments, passed down through families, shared in hushed tones within kitchens and retold at community gatherings, coalesce into a story that has endured far beyond the lifetimes of its original narrators. The year was 1949. America was still finding its footing in the aftermath of the war. The town at that time was considerably smaller, a modest collection of wooden houses, a single general store, a post office no larger than a storage shed, and the venerable Saint Brendan's church nestled at the base of the hill. That particular winter, a storm of unprecedented ferocity descended upon Kentucky, unleashing torrential rains, a thick glaze of ice, and winds powerful enough to snap utility poles. On the third night, the Ohio River surged over its banks, and the townspeople prepared for a devastating flood. Then, without any discernible warning, the wind shifted its course. The storm's trajectory altered, bypassing the hill entirely, and the floodwaters receded with astonishing speed. Some attributed their deliverance to good fortune, others believed it was something more. Among the latter were Patrick O'Connell, a veteran of the Pacific Theater, and his wife, Eileen. The storm had arrived on the very day they received confirmation that their youngest son, previously reported missing in action in Okinawa, was in fact alive and en route home. For them, this was no mere coincidence, but a clear sign. Eileen confided to her neighbors that evening over a pot of beef stew still simmering on the hearth. We owe her a promise. She saved our boy, and she saved this town. We'll keep her here where everyone can see her watching over us. By the arrival of spring, plans were being quietly set in motion. There were no official permits, no formal committees, and no architects involved, simply dedicated individuals with shovels and women who provided sustenance in the form of casseroles. Children, their laughter echoing despite the mud and their precarious footing, hauled buckets of gravel up the unpaved path. The marble itself was sourced from a quarry located 2 counties away, a generous donation from a Catholic parish unable to complete their own church renovations. A stonecutter named Carlo Mancini, who had previously crafted saints for grand basilicas in Chicago but found himself unemployed, accepted the commission without charge. For weeks, he toiled in an open-air shelter at the foot of the hill, his sole companion the rhythmic chipping of his tools against stone. Locals claim he offered silent prayers with each cut, though their content remained unintelligible. Upon its completion, the statue, depicted in flowing robes with downcast eyes and open arms, was greeted by the entire town for its placement atop the hill. This occurred just as dawn began to break. Men carried the statue, assembled in sections, up the incline, fitting the pieces together with the reverence of a sacred mosaic. The foundation was reinforced with stones contributed by each family, representing a piece of their land, their homes, and their heritage. Concealed within this foundation, Eileen O'Connell placed a folded piece of paper. Its contents remained a mystery for decades, until the relentless elements eroded the mortar sufficiently to reveal the edges of the document. It read, "If you save our town, we'll keep you here forever." Over the ensuing years, the Lady of Rosary Hill transcended her material form, becoming an intrinsic part of every personal narrative. High school seniors would visit the night before graduation, leaving behind corsages and heartfelt aspirations for their futures. War widows found solace on the stone steps, seeking respite from the overwhelming burden of their grief. Farmers offered baskets of autumnal corn and apples as tokens of her blessing. And then there were the inexplicable moments that defied rational explanation. A single candle burning through an entire January night without a single drop of wax melting. A hawk circling the hill for 3 consecutive days before vanishing without a trace. A small child who had strayed during a summer picnic was discovered 2 hours later at the statue's base, safe dry, and smiling, despite the searchers' insistence that they had meticulously guard that very area. Whether viewed as divine intervention or folklore, these stories became woven into the very fabric of St. Mary's Creek, to such an extent that when outside interests began proposing the statue's relocation, it felt less like a public works initiative and more akin to suggesting the town amputate its own heart. Inquire of the elder residents, and they will tell you the lady has graced this hill for longer than the streetlights have illuminated the town, longer than the paved road leading here, and even longer than some of the ancient trees that now stand sentinel. The younger generation might offer a shrug, until one observes their passage by the statue and notices the almost unconscious inclination of their heads as they glance upward, a silent confirmation of her continued presence. For in St. Mary's Creek, faith is not always proclaimed from the pulpit. Sometimes it is rendered in stone, standing resolute against the winds atop a hill that steadfastly refuses to relinquish its charge. The endeavor began discreetly, as most significant shifts do in smaller communities, behind closed doors and away from the public eye. Within the brick edifice of the municipal building on Main Street, beneath the steady hum of fluorescent lighting, the St. Mary's Creek City Council convened for a session designated on the agenda as a special planning session. The public was explicitly excluded. Inside, a slideshow advanced through renderings of a gleaming new development, St. Mary's Spiritual Retreat and Resort. On the projected images, Rosary Hill had undergone a dramatic transformation. The unpaved trail was replaced by a sophisticated paved drive, flanked by ornamental cherry trees. A visitor center, featuring expansive glass walls, crowned the summit. And at the periphery of the property, adjacent to the anticipated parking area, stood the statue of Our Lady, her alabaster form appearing almost luminous under the digitally rendered sunlight. This marked the first instance in over 70 years that any individual in a position of authority had proposed relocating her. To the council and the development team, the logic was irrefutable. Enhanced accessibility, improved visibility, and greater convenience for tour buses. In their assessment, the lady was a historical artifact worthy of preservation, albeit in a more advantageous position. However, this singular decision, relegated to the footnotes of an elaborate proposal, was destined to ignite a conflagration in dry tinder. The first to learn of the plan was not a council member or a journalist, but a part-time administrative assistant at the planning office, a young mother named Lisa Torres, who noticed the relocation clause while processing documents for filing. She shared the information with her aunt over breakfast the following day. By that evening, the news had spread throughout a considerable portion of the town. At Tony's diner, the regulars exchanged hushed confidences across the counter. At the grain cooperative, veteran farmers interrupted their coffee breaks to express their profound disbelief. No one had anticipated this development, yet a pervasive sense of apprehension had always lingered. The reactions were bifurcated, though not in a manner that outsiders might have predicted. Some perceived an opportunity. "This place is dying," Frank Dwyer, the owner of the local auto shop, muttered, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. A resort like that could bring jobs, bring life back to Main Street. Others, however, experienced a palpable chill. "You move her, you move the blessing," stated Ruth Kelly, who still ascended the hill every Friday, bearing a bouquet of lilies. "And when the blessing departs, nothing good follows." By Sunday's Mass, the rift within the community was undeniable. On one side of the church steps, younger couples engaged in discussions about property values and the prospect of improved educational opportunities for their children funded by increased tax revenue. On the other, older parishioners clutched their rosaries more tightly, their gazes invariably drawn to the distant hill, as if to reassure themselves of the lady's continued presence. Pastor Brennan, privy to both perspectives, remained circumspect, though he lingered at the altar rail for an extended period after the service, his lips moving in silent prayer. In addition to these factions, there were the undecided, those who grappled with uncertainty but couldn't shake the disquieting sensation that the town was treading on precarious ground. As evening descended, conversations migrated to front porches and kitchen tables. A group of teenagers gathered near the baseball field debated whether relocating the statue would break some unspoken enchantment or if it was merely an inanimate object. In the local nursing home, Martha Grady, who had been present on the day the lady was installed, reiterated to any who would listen that promises made to the heavens were not intended to be arbitrarily altered. The tension was not overt. It simmered beneath the surface. There were no organized protests or picket lines, merely a subtle shift in the way individuals regarded one another across the aisles of the grocery store. Then, the first overt act of dissent occurred. One Tuesday evening, a small contingent, numbering no more than 8 individuals, ascended Rosary Hill, carrying candles. They knelt at the base of the statue, their flickering flames dancing in the wind. They remained in silent vigil until the wax had nearly depleted, departing without uttering a word. By the following night, the assembly had doubled in size. Within a week, approximately 30 individuals were gathered on the hill, offering prayers beneath the open sky. Yet none referred to this gathering as a protest. It was something more subdued, yet more resolute. Concurrently, the developers dispatched surveyors, men clad in branded polos and baseball caps, equipped with clipboards and laser measuring devices. They meticulously traversed the slope, documented their observations through photographs, and posed inquiries such as, when was this foundation constructed, and are there any records indicating a permit for this installation? Such questions elicited an indignant response from the townsfolk. No one had ever required a permit to engage in prayer. During one of these surveying expeditions, a surveyor approached Ruth Kelly, who was once again standing with her lilies. "Ma'am," he inquired, "do you happen to know if there is any documentation detailing how this statue came to be here?" Ruth offered a faint, knowing smile. "Yes," she replied, her voice measured. "It is inscribed in stone." She then turned and walked away. News of this exchange disseminated almost as rapidly as the initial reports of the proposed relocation. The town was now distinctly divided into 2 opposing camps. The first, comprising primarily younger business owners and recent arrivals, argued that embracing change was essential for survival, asserting that sentiment alone could not sustain a community. The second, deeply rooted in families who had resided there for generations, maintained that not all forms of value could be quantified in monetary terms. And amidst this growing division, Rosary Hill remained steadfast, its lady's gaze fixed upon the town below, her marble arms extended, her countenance serene, as if she had witnessed such conflicts before and possessed an innate understanding of their eventual outcome. Yet, beneath this placid exterior, a subtle transformation was occurring, as imperceptible as the prelude to a storm. It was the kind of shift that prompts an involuntary glance over one's shoulder on an otherwise deserted street, an intimation that whatever transpired next would be far from ordinary. The initial manifestation of this phenomenon occurred for an individual who professed a disbelief in such portents. Tyler Grant, a senior architecture student interning with the development team, was assigned the straightforward task of measuring the statue's base, documenting it with photographs, and preparing a preliminary report for the proposed relocation platform. On his second morning in St. Mary's Creek, he ascended Rosary Hill, a digital tablet in one hand and a half-empty latte in the other. It was a nondescript mid-September day, with a gentle sun and a scattering of leisurely drifting clouds. He crouched, ran the laser measurer along the pedestal's edge, and grumbled about the perceived sloppiness of the original construction. Later that night, within the confines of his motel room, which had been secured by the developers, Tyler experienced a vivid dream. He envisioned the statue toppling forward, not disintegrating but falling in a single, impossibly solid mass. It crashed directly onto the architectural plans he had printed earlier that evening, reducing the paper to dust. Upon awakening, the clock displayed 3:33 in the morning. The dream left him drenched in sweat, his chest constricted, as if the air in the room had become unusually thin. By the following morning, Tyler requested a reassignment to a survey location in the downtown area, offering no explicit reason for his request. The second sign was considerably more pronounced. 2 days later, a contractor from Cincinnati named Bill Parsons arrived to assess the terrain for the deployment of heavy machinery. Bill possessed 30 years of experience in heavy lift projects, having been instrumental in moving objects ranging from Civil War artillery to grand granite memorial arches. As he ascended the hill, his boot slipped on the first step, a broad slab of limestone worn smooth by decades of exposure to the elements. He fell heavily, sustaining a fractured wrist. "That's just bad footing," the foreman later informed reporters. However, those present attested that the atmosphere had momentarily chilled and that all the birds in the adjacent maple grove had fallen silent. Subsequently, the bell made its presence known. It was a Friday evening, with sufficient daylight remaining to discern the western contours of the hills. Ruth Kelly was arranging lilies at the base of the statue when she heard it. 3 slow, resonant tolls emanating from somewhere above her. The sound was deep, metallic, and it seemed to linger in the air for an unusually prolonged duration. She glanced upward, half expecting to see someone orchestrating a prank with a portable speaker. However, there was nothing to be seen. No bell, no tower, only the expansive sky and a faint, almost imperceptible scent of rain, despite the absence of any approaching storm. By Sunday, an additional half-dozen individuals claimed to have heard the same phenomenon, always in threes, and invariably at dusk. These peculiar incidents continued to manifest. Pastor Brennan, typically disinclined to share personal revelations, confided to a colleague in Louisville that he had awakened in the dead of night to observe a faint, ethereal blue luminescence moving slowly around the statue. It was not the flickering radiance of a flashlight or a mobile phone, but a steady, circular drift that dissipated as he approached the window. Teenagers venturing up the hill for clandestine nocturnal dares returned subdued, reluctant to recount their experiences. One young man eventually admitted to witnessing a spectral figure, garbed in white, standing a few feet from the statue, her hair seemingly stirred by a phantom breeze, even though the air was entirely still. At the nursing home, Martha Grady, now too frail to make the arduous ascent, recounted to her caregiver that in a recurring dream, experienced for 3 consecutive nights, the lady had closed her eyes. Some of these occurrences could be readily dismissed through logical explanations, or so the developers contended. They spoke of optical illusions, overactive imaginations, and the inherent human tendency to perceive patterns where none truly exist. However, these rationalizations did little to quell the pervasive undercurrent of unease that permeated St. Mary's Creek. This apprehension intensified as the weather itself seemed to exhibit unusual behavior in proximity to the hill. On an unseasonably warm October afternoon, the surveying crew reported encountering sudden, icy gusts of wind that rattled their measuring instruments and scattered their clipboards, despite the air being calm and temperate merely 50 yards down the slope. One morning, a young mother named Jamie Russell carried her 2-year-old son up the hill to place chrysanthemums in memory of her late grandfather. Midway up the incline, the child began to giggle and point towards an empty space beside the statue, exclaiming, "Lady's hand." Jaime initially paid it little mind until she noticed her son's small palm felt warm, as if it had been held, though the surrounding air was noticeably cool. That evening she shared the anecdote with her husband, who in turn recounted it to his brother, who then shared it with 3 other patrons at the local bar. By the weekend, the story had become a topic of widespread discussion throughout the town. Despite these pervasive murmurs and cautionary tales, the official project timeline remained unchanged. The developers maintained their commitment to proceeding with the relocation as scheduled. Local officials attempted to frame the incidents as mere coincidences, yet the workers directly involved began to exhibit palpable hesitation. Gus, a crane operator who had spent the majority of his career lifting bridge span across state lines, admitted to a friend at the hardware store that he had been experiencing persistent headaches whenever he set foot on the hill. "Not like normal headaches," he elaborated, rubbing his temple. "It feels like someone is standing directly behind me, just staring." Even those who had initially supported the project began to quietly concede that perhaps, just perhaps, it was unwise to provoke whatever unseen forces appeared to be at play. One night, without any prearranged plan, nearly 40 townsfolk congregated at the base of the hill. Some carried candles, while others simply stood with their hands tucked into their coat pockets, their gazes fixed upon the statue. They remained in complete silence, so profound that the distant murmur of the creek, nearly half a mile away, was audible. Then, faintly but unmistakably, 3 slow tolls of a bell echoed down the slope. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "She's warning us." For nearly a full minute, no one moved. Later, when questioned about the perceived meaning of the warning, the responses varied. Some believed it signified their obligation not to disturb her. Others predicted dire consequences if they proceeded, and a few suggested it might already be too late to alter the course of events. However, regardless of the individual interpretations, a shared sentiment prevailed. The Lady of Rosary Hill was no longer merely observing the town. She was communicating with it, albeit without uttering a single word. And the town, whether willingly or not, was beginning to heed her silent message. The initial attempt to relocate the statue commenced on a crisp Monday morning in late October. The sun rose clear, the air was still, and from a distance, Rosary Hill appeared undisturbed, tranquil, and seemingly indifferent. However, at its base, the scene was anything but ordinary. 2 flatbed trucks idled beside a colossal crane, its structure rivaling that of a 3-story building. Steel cables, coiled like slumbering serpents, lay strewn across the ground. Workers in protective headgear moved with the practiced efficiency of individuals who had performed similar tasks on countless prior occasions. For the crew, this was merely another assignment. However, for the residents of St. Mary's Creek, it represented the long-feared culmination. By 8 o'clock in the morning, a modest assembly had gathered at the foot of the incline. No banners were displayed, no voices were raised in protest, only silent observers were present. Some clutched their mugs of coffee, while others held their rosaries. A few stood with their arms crossed, their expressions inscrutable. The supervisor issued sharp directives. Ropes were slung over shoulders and drawn up the incline. Laborers secured them around the base of the effigy, double-checking the knots. From a purely structural perspective, the undertaking should have been straightforward. The sculpted stone weighed slightly less than 2 tons, a load well within the lifting capacity of the crane. At 8:27, the crane's engine roared to life. The rope grew taut, the boom arm ascended, yet the statue remained immobile. The operator furrowed his brow, gently adjusted the controls, and then increased the tension. The metal groaned, the pressure indicator climbed, and with a sudden sharp severance, one of the primary ropes snapped free, striking the earth. A worker stumbled backward, narrowly averting a tumble down the slope. The supervisor swore, ordered the site closed for an examination, and informed the onlookers that they would return the following day. The second attempt was conducted with less public visibility. On Tuesday, shortly after sunrise, the crew returned with new ropes, stronger than the previous ones. In addition to the crane, they brought a winch truck. The strategy was to hoist and swivel the statue onto a waiting flatbed truck. This time, there were fewer onlookers, only a scattering of townspeople who had learned of the unscheduled commencement. Once more, the ropes were fastened, and the signal was given. The winch motor rumbled, the crane tilted slightly forward under the strain, but the statue remained steadfast. The only movement was the winch truck, its tires sinking approximately 1 inch into the ground, as if resisting an unseen force. The operator ceased the power. A few workers exchanged hesitant glances, murmuring about excessive weight and unstable footing, despite the ground being dry and firm. By the third effort, the project developers were exhibiting increasing impatience. Thursday morning, they arrived with additional resources: another crane, a larger workforce, and a heavy-duty lowboy trailer. The revised plan involved excavating around the base, dislodging the foundation, and then lifting. The backhoe commenced its work, its bucket digging into the soil adjacent to the pedestal. At a depth of 10 inches, the machinery began to shudder uncontrollably. The operator asserted that the bucket felt as though it had struck something animate. Moments later, a loud crack echoed through the air, and the hydraulic arm froze in mid-movement. A thin jet of hydraulic fluid hissed onto the dirt, forming a pool at the operator's feet. Work was halted once more. Tools were inspected and components were replaced. There was nothing within the mechanism to account for the sudden malfunction. By this point, speculation was spreading more rapidly than the machinery. Whispers circulated about dreams occurring at 3:33 in the morning, the resonance of a bell, and a chilling wind that never reached the lower sections of the town. The fourth attempt never progressed beyond the preparatory stages. Saturday morning, the crew was halfway through securing the lifting apparatus when the weather abruptly changed. There were no clouds, no prior indication, merely a gust of air so fierce that it sent paper blueprints scattering down the incline like startled avians. Protective helmets clattered against heads. Several workers stepped back from the statue, averting that the wind felt colder than chilled water. "Let's just get this done," the foreman yelled. They never had the opportunity. Without any preceding thunder or the slightest hint of precipitation, a solitary bolt of lightning struck the ground less than 15 feet from the statue's base. The accompanying sound was deafening, and the flash was blinding. One individual dropped to his knees, covering his ears. Another fell backward, unharmed but visibly pale. The foreman radioed the operator, "Cease operations immediately." By that afternoon, the heavy machinery was being reloaded onto trailers. The developers released a brief statement to the local newspaper, citing unforeseen technical difficulties and pledging to review safety procedures before resuming operations. However, everyone present on the incline that week understood the true nature of the situation. Among the crew, no one evinced a desire to be the one to attempt it again. One crane operator requested a transfer out of state. A welder resigned on the spot, yet the statue remained precisely as it had been. With its arms extended, its gaze lowered, the marble surface bore no marks, as if the steel cables had never made contact with it. The townspeople did not rejoice. There were no exclamations of triumph, no celebratory speeches, only quiet acknowledgments exchanged between neighbors and a few additional candles placed at its feet. One evening, Ruth Kelly ascended the incline alone, carrying a bouquet of lilies. She paused a few feet from the base, bent down, and brushed some dirt from the edge of the foundation. She then uttered a few words inaudibly to anyone else. Those who witnessed her stated that she offered a faint smile as she descended the hill. Whether that smile signified relief or a veiled warning depended on individual interpretation. When reports began to arrive from St. Mary's Creek, most news organizations dismissed them as minor local occurrences. This was not the case, however, for the Courier-Ledger, a regional publication based in Louisville, renowned for its human interest features. This is how Ethan Cole became involved in the narrative. At the age of 28, Ethan was still regarded as the junior member of the newsroom. He was intelligent and driven, yet possessed a profound skepticism. He had cultivated a reputation for debunking urban legends, exposing supposedly haunted houses as having issues with mold, and revealing miracle cures as mere repackaged supplements. When his editor slid a slender folder across his desk, containing 3 printed emails and a handful of cell phone photographs of Rosary Hill, Ethan raised an eyebrow. "A statue they can't move," he remarked. "You want me to report on that?" The editor leaned back. "I want you to uncover the truth. Write your findings, Dispense with the myth. That's your forte, isn't it? Ethan drove into town on a Thursday afternoon. He wore a navy button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his sunglasses tucked into the collar, and a camera bag rested on the passenger seat. He anticipated arriving in a tranquil settlement, clinging to a historical artifact, desperately seeking attention. What he encountered was a subdued atmosphere, carrying a greater weight than he had imagined. The main thoroughfare was lined with brick commercial buildings, some vacant, others still operating. The inhabitants moved at a leisurely pace, their gazes invariably drifting toward the hill, almost instinctively. The statue, visible from a distance of half a mile, seemed to serve as an anchor for the horizon. His initial interviews were characterized by politeness, but a certain guardedness. At Tony's diner, a waitress named Carla served his coffee and responded to his inquiries with faint smiles. "You can write whatever you wish, dear," she commented, "but please don't mock her." At the grain cooperative, a retired farmer offered a comparable caution. "Believe it or not, just don't make light of the lady. That never ends well." No one attempted to persuade him of supernatural occurrences. No one thrust photographs into his hand. It seemed as though the entire town had tacitly agreed that their role was not to convert him, but simply to ensure he recognized the established boundaries. That first evening, Ethan checked into the town's sole motel. He reviewed the video footage he had captured of the hill from various vantage points. At the 7-minute mark of the second recording, something flickered behind the statue. A white, fleeting motion, almost like fabric catching the light. He paused the frame and zoomed in. It could have been a trick of the light. It could have been nothing. The subsequent morning, he ascended Rosary Hill by himself. The air was cool and the grass was damp. He stood at the base of the statue, notebook in hand, meticulously documenting details. The marble exhibited signs of weathering, with faint chisel marks visible along the folds of the robe. A hairline fracture at the base appeared to extend deeper than its surface indicated. Midway through his observational notes, an elderly woman clad in a wool coat appeared beside him. "You're the reporter," she stated. "I haven't been asked," Ethan replied. "What will you write about her?" "I'm still determining that," he responded. She scrutinized him for a considerable duration, then advised, "Don't write to prove, write to listen. The lady doesn't require defense. She simply requires understanding." And with that, she departed down the hill without further comment. That evening, Ethan planned to conduct a drone flight to obtain aerial photographs of the statue. The weather conditions were optimal, clear skies and minimal wind. However, 15 seconds into its ascent, the live video feed abruptly froze. The drone's battery indicator plummeted from 86% to 0 instantaneously, and the device fell from the sky. Upon reaching it, he discovered that nothing was physically damaged, except for the perplexing anomaly that the battery now registered as fully charged. He experienced a restless night. At 3:33 in the morning, a sound roused him from his slumber, not loud, but possessing a profound resonance, akin to a bell heard underwater. He stepped to the window. Rosary Hill was faintly discernible in the moonlight, but the silhouette of the statue was unmistakable, standing as it had for 70 years. By the fourth day, Ethan ceased attempting to categorize the town's disquiet within conventional journalistic frameworks. He continued to take notes and record video, but his inquiries evolved. He shifted his focus from the technical aspects of moving marble to the underlying reasons why no one desired its relocation. He found himself walking the hill in the late afternoons, remaining until the light receded into a dusky blue. Occasionally, others were present, lighting candles or leaving floral tributes. At times, it was merely he and the statue. His skepticism had not vanished, but it was undergoing a transformation, giving way to an emotion he could not yet articulate. A sensation that this location held more significance than mere folklore, and that the lady was more than just carved stone. And whether he consciously acknowledged it or not, he was beginning to feel an integral part of the unfolding events. It was Carla, the waitress from the diner, who directed Ethan to her. "The last house on Willow Lane," she informed him while replenishing his coffee. "White porch, rocking chair. If anyone possesses insight into the truth about the lady, it is Mrs. Martha Grady." Martha was 91 years old, her frame delicate, yet her gaze was resolute. She occupied her porch with an air of permanence, enveloped in a knitted shawl, observing the hill with the same attentiveness some people reserve for the ocean. When Ethan arrived, she made no inquiry about his identity or purpose. She simply motioned to the vacant chair beside her. "You wish to know her origins?" she inquired. Ethan nodded, indicating that it was indeed a question. Martha's gaze shifted toward Rosary Hill, and for a prolonged period she remained silent. The breeze stirred the edges of her shawl. "It was the winter of '49, she commenced, her voice low yet distinct. "We possessed very little in St. Mary's Creek back then. No paved roads, no grocery store, barely enough congregants to fill the church on Sundays. But we had each other, and we had that hill. Folks said it was the highest point in the county, and on clear days you could see the river gleaming 30 miles distant. That January, a storm descended that should have submerged us. Days of relentless rain, ice thick enough to fracture tree limbs, wind that howled as if it were tearing the sky asunder. The river rose with alarming rapidity, too swiftly, and everyone understood it was only a matter of hours before it overflowed its banks." Martha leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped. And then, as if by an unseen hand, it ceased. The wind shifted, the water levels receded, and the storm veered eastward. The following morning, one could walk to the edge of the town and observe the path the flood had been traversing, heading directly towards us before it changed course. She paused, allowing the recollection to settle between them. People attributed it to good fortune, but not Eileen O'Connell. Eileen and her husband Patrick were among the few Irish immigrant families in town. Their son had recently returned from the war, alive after being listed as missing for months. On the night the storm abated, Eileen informed anyone who would listen that they owed a pledge to the Blessed Mother. "If you saved our son and you saved our town," she declared, "then we will keep you here eternally." The promise quickly evolved into a plan. No permits were obtained, no fundraising campaigns were initiated, merely neighbors transporting stone and timber up the slope. A stonemason named Carlo Mancini, who was unemployed and facing dire circumstances, undertook the task without charge. "He was an artist," Martha recounted softly. "He spoke little, but as he carved her visage, it was as though he already knew her intimately." The statue was erected in the spring. The entire community convened at its base. Men in their finest suits, women in their dresses, children carrying whatever blossoms they could gather. Every family contributed a single stone to be incorporated into the foundation, a piece of themselves placed beneath her feet. And then, when no one was observing, Eileen secreted a folded piece of paper deep within the wet mortar. Martha witnessed her action. She divulged the contents to no one for decades. The years elapsed. Crops failed and flourished anew. Children departed for the cities. The church steeple was replaced on 2 occasions. The lady endured through snow, heat, and hail. She never appeared to age. Then, one summer, a section of the foundation crumbled sufficiently to reveal the edge of something pale and fragile. Martha, already in her 70s, brushed away the dust. It was the paper, still folded, still intact. We did not unseal it immediately. It did not feel appropriate, but Eileen, in her final days, requested it. The letter was simple, a single sentence penned in Eileen's meticulous hand. "If you save our town, we will keep you here forever." When Ethan inquired about its disposition, Martha's lips curved into a faint smile. "It is still there, precisely where she placed it. You cannot see it now, but you do not need to. The lady remembers." For a period, neither of them spoke. Down the street, a pickup truck rumbled past. The driver raised 2 fingers in greeting without decelerating. Martha finally turned to him. "You came here seeking a narrative you could explain," she stated. "But this one is not about explanations. It is about a promise. And promises of that nature do not break easily." Ethan glanced toward Rosary Hill, the statue catching the waning light. From his vantage point, it appeared less like carved marble and more like a living entity. Listening, and for the first time since his arrival, he was uncertain which version of the story he believed. The directive arrived on a Monday morning, precise and bureaucratic. "Proceed with relocation," it read, "with no qualifications or delays." By Thursday, Rosary Hill no longer resembled a hilltop. It looked like a staging area. 3 cranes loomed against the sky, their arms extending over the ridge like siege engines. Flatbed trucks lined the access road. A dozen men in high-visibility vests moved among coils of cable and stacks of lumber, their radios emitting intermittent bursts of static. It was the largest crew the town had ever assembled. Specialists had been brought in from Nashville and Chicago. Individuals accustomed to relocating lighthouses and Civil War monuments. For them, this was simply another task. For the residents observing from the base of the hill, it felt like an intrusion. By 8 o'clock, a crowd had gathered. No one shouted, no one carried protest signs. They simply stood shoulder to shoulder, their gazes fixed on the summit where the white statue rose above the machinery. The plan, as outlined on paper, was straightforward. Step 1. Excavate the foundation and free the base. Step 2. Lift the statue using a crane onto a steel platform. Step 3. Load it onto a reinforced flatbed for transport to its new, more accessible location near the highway. At 8:15, the first drill engaged the foundation. From the base of the hill, the sound was a persistent metallic whine, almost entirely masked by the wind. However, on the ridge, the men perceived it differently. A vibration that coursed through their footwear, as if the very ground were reluctant. By 8:20, the drill stalled. It did not jam or break. It simply ceased functioning. The bit refused to rotate, despite the motor operating at full power. Mechanics converged on the rig, murmuring about torque settings and electrical malfunctions. The foreman requested the second drill. It operated for 12 seconds before its bits snapped cleanly in 2. The crowd at the bottom shifted with apprehension. The foreman decided to bypass the initial step and hook the crane directly to ascertain if the statue would budge without completely dislodging the base. Heavy nylon straps were looped beneath the lady's outstretched arms, secured with steel shackles substantial enough to anchor a vessel. From his operator's seat, a man named Hal gave a thumbs-up signal. The crane groaned, the straps tightened, and for the first time in over 70 years, the statue shifted a fraction of an inch, perhaps 2. The crowd gasped, a mixture of awe and dread. Then, the wind arrived. It was not the wind of a storm. There were no dark clouds, no scent of rain. It was a frigid, piercing gust from the west, sharp enough to sting exposed skin. The kind of wind that imparts a metallic taste to the air. Hal swore within his cabin. His controls flickered. The hydraulic pressure gauge dropped inexplicably. The crane shuddered. The straps went slack, and a sound like a deep, resonant gong rolled down the hill. The workers froze. So did the crowd. It sounded again. 3 deep tolls, slow and deliberate. No bell stood on that hill. Yet the sound was sufficiently real to vibrate within one's ribcage. Hal attempted to operate again, pushing the controls forward. The crane arm ascended half a foot before every alarm on the console simultaneously illuminated. Overload, hydraulic fault, power surge. The engine sputtered and died in a plume of black smoke. The foreman barked for the backup crane. Its operator had barely extended the boom before the radio clipped to his hip erupted in a piercing screech of static. He snatched it from his belt. The casing was hot to the touch. Then, lightning, A single bolt, white and blue, blindingly bright, split the sky and struck the ground 10 feet from the statue. There had been no preceding thunderheads, no warning, only a sudden, precise strike. One of the men closest to the impact, an ironworker named James, was thrown backward. He landed with considerable force but remained conscious, his eyes wide, adamantly asserting that in the instant before he hit the ground, he had felt a hand on his chest. A small hand, warm. The foreman did not request another attempt. He ordered all machinery powered down and every man evacuated from the hill. Below, the crowd stood in stunned silence. Some made the sign of the cross. Others simply stared, as if trying to commit to memory the exact appearance of the statue in that moment, undisturbed, unblemished, her marble countenance serene beneath a sky that had abruptly returned to calm. Within an hour, the hilltop was deserted, save for the lady. The cranes, the trucks, the crews, all had departed, leaving deep tire impressions in the grass and a few discarded lengths of cable coiled like discarded skins. By dusk, the only audible sound was the rustling of leaves. Candles began appearing at the base. 1, then 3. Subsequently, a ring of flickering light encircled the pedestal. No one could identify who initiated the practice. Later that night, as the town settled into an uneasy quiet, an unseasonable rain swept through. 15 minutes of steady silver sheets that soaked the streets and shimmered in the glow of the hilltop candles. The following morning, everything was dry. The cables were gone. The cranes had been removed, and the lady still stood in the same position she had occupied since the spring of 1949. Her arms extended, her gaze cast downward toward the town. The relocation project was not formally rescinded. The developers never issued an official statement, but the heavy machinery never returned. Those who were present that day will tell you they witnessed a failed engineering endeavor. Nothing more. However, if you ask the others, those who heard the tolling bell, who felt the chilling wind, who saw lightning descend from a cloudless sky, they will contend that the lady on Rosary Hill made her answer unequivocally clear. And it was not a simple no, but rather, do not attempt this again. Following the final endeavor, a quiet descended upon the hill. Not the kind of silence that is immediately noticeable, but the sort that gradually grows day by day until one realizes something is absent. There were no more engines, no more shouted instructions from men measuring and drilling, no more steel cables snaking across the grass, only the whisper of wind through the maples, the soft crunch of footsteps from those who still ascended the slope, and the occasional murmur of a prayer. The developers did not hold a press conference. The city council made no announcement. The relocation date simply vanished from the agenda, and the glossy promotional posters for the saint. Mary's spiritual retreat and resort began to disappear from shop windows one by one. To the town's inhabitants, that silence conveyed a more profound message than any official declaration. In the ensuing weeks, life in Saint Mary's Creek gradually resumed its accustomed rhythm. Yet, it was not the same as it had been previously. Those who had advocated for the move no longer spoke of opportunity with the same conviction. Some avoided the topic altogether. Others, discreetly and without fanfare, began joining the evening strolls up Rosary Hill. For years, Ruth Kelly, a devoted visitor who had brought lilies to the monument every Friday for several decades, observed a subtle yet undeniable shift. The pathways saw an increase in foot traffic. It wasn't just older individuals. Young couples, teenagers, and even children holding their parents' hands were now present. Some arrived bearing floral tributes, while others simply sought a few moments of quiet reflection in the open air beside the iconic figure. Even Ethan Cole, the journalist initially approaching the situation with the sharp certainty of a skeptic, underwent a transformation. He now carried a small journal filled not with sensational exposés, but with prose that read more like heartfelt invocations. He never openly declared a belief in the miraculous. However, when questioned about his continued presence in town weeks after his assignment had concluded, he would offer only the explanation, "Certain narratives require more time to reach their conclusion." He began to participate in the evening assemblies, not as a professional observer, but as another contemplative soul within the gathering. He would light candles, absorb the gentle cadence of hymns, and familiarize himself with the names of those whose lives had been profoundly impacted, in both significant and minor ways, by the lady perched upon the hill. Although the proposed relocation had been definitively abandoned, Rosary Hill itself started to change, not in its physical structure, but in the collective care it received. Volunteers undertook the task of leveling the unpaved trail and then lining it with gravel. At the base of the monument, a modest wooden structure materialized, intended for the placement of bouquets and handwritten sentiments. No single individual stepped forward to claim responsibility for its construction, yet its utility was universally embraced. Even Martha Grady, now too infirm to ascend the incline herself, insisted that her niece transport her up once a month. She would settle into a foldable chair at the base, her gaze perpetually fixed upon the marble visage. "It's not about achieving victory," she confided to Ethan one afternoon, her voice a soft murmur against the wind. "It's about upholding one's commitment." The dispute surrounding the monument had fractured the town, but in its hushed aftermath, a different sentiment began to take root. The hill evolved from being merely a point of reference to representing a pledge revitalized. This wasn't solely the fulfillment of the O'Connells' pledge made in 1949, but rather a shared recognition that certain things are preserved not for their commercial value, but for their inherent sanctity. The lady remained steadfast in her position, yet the people around her were in motion. Tourists began to encounter her narrative. At times, it was recounted by local shopkeepers, at other times, by a stranger encountered in a roadside eatery. Consequently, a modest stream of visitors started to arrive, drawn by her story. They did not arrive in large numbers aboard buses, but rather in small groups, couples and families, often departing as discreetly as they had arrived, and while some captured her image with their cameras, many simply stood in quiet contemplation, as if awaiting the possibility of hearing a distant chime. One crisp autumn evening, shortly before dusk, the entirety of the hill appeared to be bathed in a luminous golden hue. The candles cast a flickering glow, the leaves of the maple trees rustled in the breeze, and the white marble absorbed the day's final radiant beams. Ethan stood amidst the assembled onlookers, his camera resting, unused, within its protective case. Within the pages of his journal, he inscribed a singular declaration. It wasn't that she could not be moved, but rather that she should not be. Back in the heart of the town, the council chambers maintained a notable silence on the subject of Rosary Hill. The developers never reappeared. The project documentation was ultimately archived, and with the passage of time, even the most ambitious proponents ceased to allude to the proposed resort. For St. Mary's Creek, this quiet resolution constituted a victory in itself. And for the lady on the hill, it was simply another interval in an enduring vigil that had already encompassed multiple generations. Those who visit today seldom speak of dramatic weather events or unexplained bell tolls. Instead, they remark upon the panoramic vista from the summit, the profound sense of tranquility, and the uncanny feeling, after a prolonged period of standing there, of sensing the very pulse of the town below. Perhaps this indeed represents the true miracle. Not a statue, unyielding in its immobility, but a community that collectively chose to remain steadfast alongside her. Therefore, should your travels ever lead you down the less traveled roads of Kentucky and you happen to glimpse a shimmer of white marble above the tree line, consider pulling over, embarking on the short walk, and standing at her feet. You do not require an inherent belief in the miraculous to comprehend her enduring presence. All that is necessary is to lend an ear. If this narrative resonated with you, please consider bestowing a like upon this video. Share it with someone who might benefit from a moment of solace today. And ensure you subscribe to Touched by Grace to stay abreast of our forthcoming narratives, where faith, enigma, and the depths of the human spirit converge.